Fairchild Air Force Base, Spokane, Washington. A B-52, the biggest bomber ever built, takes a practice flight in preparation for an air show. On board are 4 airmen. At the controls is a man some say is the best B-52 pilot in the Air Force, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Bud Holland. Ironically, his co-pilot is a man who is trying to get Holland grounded as reckless. After completing a series of banks and low-altitude maneuvers, Colonel Holland turns the aircraft into a very steep turn, circling the tower one last time before landing. Then, the unbelievable happens. Spectators cry out in disbelief. Another angle shows the huge bomber flying too low. It loses lift and drops quickly, clipping a high-voltage power line. The bomber narrowly misses a munitions bunker and barracks housing dozens of soldiers. The entire crew is killed. Sadly, it's a crash foreseen by the plane's co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Mark McGeehan. His father, Richard McGeehan, says his son predicted Holland would kill someone with his daredevil flying. He says his son was on board to make sure Holland flew safely, because other airmen were afraid to fly with him.
They were scared of him. They didn't want to ride with him. That's why they complained to my son, who was a squadron commander, and he took care of the men that served under him.
Arnie Weinman was a B-52 pilot and former base commander who flew several times with Bud Holland.
He was excellent. He was outstanding. And in all of my flights with him, well, he was aggressive. That's what we wanted in our military flyers and B-52s.
But according to local journalist Jim Camden, Holland had a reputation for unsafe flying.
As the wife of one of the younger pilots told us, he could fly the fire out of a B-52. And he had a reputation for being able to do things with it that nobody else could. He also had a reputation for being reckless and doing some things that you should not do with a B-52.
Even his former commander, Arnie Weinman, had to reprimand him once. 3 years before the crash, he asked Holland to fly over the edge of the runway during a base ceremony. But Holland did something that caused people to flee in fear.
He chose to overfly the parade ground where we were doing this exchange, and much, much too low. And I called him in and gave him a verbal reprimand. We thought that would be the end of it.
But it wasn't.
Felt a little wind on that one.
Just weeks before the crash, a photographer asks Holland to perform some low-altitude flyovers. Weinman is retired by now, but Holland's new superior okays the flight.
You got a visual.
Colonel Holland shows his remarkable skill by flying the massive bomber just a few dozen feet above the valley floor, then below the ridgeline to the photographer's position. Days later, Holland's crew files complaints of reckless flying. Holland is reprimanded for flying too low by his superiors, but they allow him to continue flying. Colonel McGeehan, Holland's squadron leader, is afraid Holland's antics will lead to tragedy and tries to have him grounded for good.
Mark was always a man that when something had to be done, he did it. And there had to be something done about Holland, and he took the only course he had. He went to his superior officer and asked him to be grounded.
His commander disagrees, but McGeehan vows to fly with Holland from then on to keep him within Air Force regulations. Their next flight together is the practice run before the air show. Holland is piloting, and Colonel McGeehan is the co-pilot on their final flight.
They were coming in for a landing, and they were basically waved off. There was something else on the runway, and so they were told to go around.
The plane goes into a steep left turn 300 feet from the ground. It stalls briefly, but Holland recovers by straightening it out. The plane then turns into a steeper and much more dangerous angle.
52 Light with 8 engines can easily hold 60-degree bank angles. You just don't do them low down because there's no margin for error.
But the bomber is at a 90-degree angle, just 200 feet from the ground. At that angle, the plane stalls again and loses lift because there's not enough air moving over the wing to keep the plane aloft.
Some of us that have flown a great deal and have flown a great deal with Colonel Holland find it hard to believe that he would have gotten into that position.
Experts speculate he made the steep turn to avoid flying over the base's munitions bunker. Doing so is dangerous, and a safety infraction so serious a pilot can be grounded for it.
Around the tower.
Realizing he is going to crash, McGeehan ejects just as the plane's wingtip cuts through several power lines, but he's too late to save himself. The enormous bomber crashes into a field just beyond the barracks. Flight controllers never hear a distress call from the plane, and what happened inside the cockpit between Holland and McGeehan during the final seconds will never be known. For security reasons, military aircraft do not carry cockpit voice and flight data recorders, as required on large commercial planes. But the conflict was a basic one, pitting a hotshot flyer against an officer who refused to compromise safety.
He wasn't going to fly according to the rules. It's one thing that he had against Mark, because Mark flew according to the book.
The ensuing investigation blames the accident on unsafe flying by Colonel Holland and on a failure to discipline him earlier. The base commander who allowed Holland to fly is stripped of command. And as for Mark McGeehan, some say he died a hero for trying to rein in a dangerous flyer, even though doing so cost him his life.